see so many of you here this afternoon, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this afternoon's Wyant Lecture. I first want to welcome some current and former members of our board who are here with us, members of the Wyant Doherty family who are joining us, our alumni, and I also want to give a very special welcome today to three faculty emeriti, Dr. Mary Mason from our English department. Some of you will remember Dr. Mason, and actually she's the one who hired me back to the college in 1975. And my colleague, Dr. Jerry Bernhardt, also from the English department, and Britta Fisher, who's here from the Social department. I especially am delighted to welcome our speaker, Jim Carroll. I have known and admired Jim for so many years, and with you, I'm sure I remember reading his early novels like Mortal Friends and Prince of Peace, and of course his most recent publication, Practicing Catholic. So it's really a pleasure, Jim, to welcome you back. And I know that we are in for a thought-provoking and insightful lecture this afternoon. Come on in. We have room. Today's program is also significant as it is our very first opportunity in this setting on this campus to welcome our new Louise Doherty Wyant professor, Dr. Lenore Martin. So let's welcome Lenore back in a new capacity. She's a preeminent scholar in Middle Eastern studies, and Lenore has been a member of the Emmanuel faculty since 1973, so she knows lots and lots of alums. She was appointed to the Wyant professorship last fall. Soon after her appointment, she left to go to Turkey to spend a semester as a senior research Fulbright scholar, and that is, of course, a very impressive and well-deserved honor. Her research and scholarship is widely known, and in addition to her work at Emmanuel, Lenore is Research Associate of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies and an Associate at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, both at Harvard. And Lenore has enthusiastically embraced her new role at the college, and we are thrilled that she is back to campus this semester to share her wisdom, to keep on challenging our students, and of course, to enlist engaging speakers, the first of which is Jim Carroll, to join us for today's lecture. Lenore?
Thank you, Sister Janet, and the Wyant family for allowing me the honor and the joy, really, to introduce James Carroll to speak to such an eager and interested Emmanuel College audience today. And no wonder we are eager. James Carroll has been challenging us to question and to think about some of the most profound questions of the day. He has done this through novels, nonfiction, a documentary, and of course, his Monday opinion columns in the Boston Globe. If you are a writer, a reader, an artist, a natural scientist, a political scientist, a historian, a religious studies scholar, sociologist, psychologist, philosopher, business manager, economist, lawyer, judge, physician, or interested member of society, he has raised your awareness about the human condition and your role in the world. James Carroll began his career as a priest during the Vietnam War. The son of a general, he questioned the war and its tactics. He moved on from the priesthood, becoming a successful and gifted writer. As a writer, he wrote 10 novels and 6 nonfiction books, with another about to be published. One of these works, Constantine's Sword, was developed into a documentary, enabling even more access to the profound discussion of the relationship between times of misuse of religion and the resulting inhumanity presented basically in the text, which to support his theory. Little of contemporary morality has escaped his very keen intellect and values-based analysis. In American Requiem, he tells his own family story of their wrenching differences over the Vietnam War. In Constantine's Sword, Carroll takes on the question of the role of the church in anti-Semitism and in the documentary derived from the book, but begun after 9/11, I just referred to the documentary, includes questions of Islamic and Christian fundamentalism. His latest work, Practicing Catholic, is explained by the author as a religious and cultural history addressed to everyone concerned about belief and disbelief. For those of you who have not yet read the book, we'll have a few of them over at the reception, which will follow this talk, so that you can purchase, and I'm sure we can prevail upon the author to sign. In early 2011, James Carroll's book, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the Ancient City That Ignited the Modern World, will be published. We have had a peek of his thinking of this new book from his recent 6-part series on Middle East peace that he shared with us through his column in the Boston Globe. James Carroll makes us responsible for our own actions in our own faith, in our citizenship, and in our human relations. For this thought-provoking work, he has been on the New York Times bestseller list for 4 different books. That's right, 4. That's what I counted. He is a recipient, I wanted to be sure I didn't miss anything. He is a recipient of the National Book Award and the first Penn Galbraith Award given for notable literary merit and critical perspective. That critical perspective, that's what we all look to James Carroll for. I do not say this politely, but for the sake of accuracy, he received many, many times more awards than I'm listing here, from literary groups to interfaith groups and national newspapers such as the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Christian Science Monitor. When I thought about whom to invite to speak to Emmanuel College on my chosen topic of peace for the Wyant Lectures this year, there was no doubt in my mind that James Carroll was the place to begin our journey. Since 9/11, the United States has been at war against terrorism, at war in Iraq, and at war in Afghanistan. Many of you sitting here were very young on September 11th, 2001. How did we get to where we are today? And how may we move beyond and differently in the future? James Carroll will lead us on an intellectual discovery this afternoon on war, peace, and the American conscience. Please join me in welcoming Jim to our campus.
Well, right this moment, the honor that pleases me by far the most is being here at Emmanuel with you. To have that introduction from Lenore Martin, a woman whom I admire so much and from whom I've learned so much, and to have the event kicked off by Sister Janet Eisner, it's just beyond my ability to express my appreciation. And to be the first Wyant lecturer under Lenore's sponsorship is a deep honor for me, and I want to acknowledge the Wyant family. And thank you, Lenore. And congratulations to you for holding this distinguished chair. And also like to acknowledge my long-standing debt to Emmanuel College. This place has been one of the stars in the firmament of my Boston universe. I love this place. When I was looking for a place I could trust and dare to expose myself in a way of vulnerability, it was here in this very room that I screened to one of the first audiences the documentary you refer to, Constantine's Sword. I'm accustomed, having published 16 or 17 books, to being terrified when the book is published, but that was nothing compared to the terror I felt when the movie was out, because what would my mother say, you know? And My mother used to say two things to me all the time. Of course, I love you, but beyond that, who do you think you are? And what will people say? In other words, I feel at home here, and I hope I'm not presumptuous to regard myself as part of the Emmanuel family. So, war and peace. In a way, I'd like to suggest that that's my text. War and peace across a century. Human beings have always lived with the condition of violence. And the solution to violence in the human condition has always somehow involved more violence. The solution to violence is violence. That's always been the case for as far back into prehistory as we can go. And yet the presumption I'm making in my remarks tonight is that something new has happened in the American condition within living memory. And in fact, so that the text, if the text of my remarks is war and peace, the context, I want to define the context by picking out two major moments within living memory that define what's different about the human condition and violence today. And that's the answer to the question that Lenore just put before us, which is, how did we come to be where we are? And how did our country come to be where it is right now, at war in two places, and at war in a more abstract and ethereal and in some way threatening way globally? How did we get here? And my conviction, of course, being as someone radically committed to the values for which this institution stands, is that we'll understand where we are if we understand more fully where we come from. So what I want to talk about tonight is where we come from. So the context of my text is defined by two great dates for Emmanuel College. The first is 1919, and the second is 1979. And I know that some of you already know why I have chosen those two dates to establish the context of what we're talking about. What happened in 1919? Well, perhaps the most momentous event on the global scene, of course, was the founding of Emmanuel College. But other things happened that year. Only 5 years before, Henry James, living in Europe, had felt what he described as the pull of a Niagara current. That's his image, a Niagara current. Picture the Niagara Falls. Picture the water upstream from the Niagara Falls. Picture how the water picks up speed, even as it smooths out. And at a certain point, you can feel the ratcheting of the gears of the current, of the Niagara current, heading towards something. And it's only if you've been there before that you know what it is. Henry James said in 1913, there is a Niagara current pulling Europe toward war. And of course, the war came in 1914. And that current is my subject. What is that current? And of course, my assumption, my understanding is that current didn't stop running in 1914. It's been running ever since. And I want to lift up, especially in terms of these two dates, how that current can be defined. In 1919, while the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur were establishing this institution here, and by the way, it was also the year that Prohibition was passed. It was also the year, remembered in the North End of Boston in a particular way, that a molasses factory exploded and 2 million gallons of molasses flowed down the hill in the North End and killed 21 people, a tidal wave of molasses. There are days to this to this very time, when on certain warm, humid summer afternoons, you can pick up the aroma from the brick of molasses. That's 1919. In 1919, the Irish launched their guerrilla war against the British. In 1919, get this, the British were defeated in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan came into its independence. In 1919, the peace conference convened at Versailles, and the treaty was agreed to. And the United States Senate refused to ratify that treaty, suggesting that the current that had caught America was at work even after the war. In 1919, the League of Nations was established. And again, the United States signed the treaty establishing the League of Nations, a new structure of order as an alternative to war. And again, the United States Senate refused to ratify the League of Nations. In 1919, the United States Marines invaded Costa Rica, and then later in the year they invaded Honduras. In 1919, a man named Benito Mussolini established the Fascist Party in Italy. In 1919, the Weimar Republic was established in Germany. And in 1919, a young, unknown front fighter, as they called him, was released from a hospital in Munich and soon gave a speech in a beer hall calling for the irrevocable removal of the Jews, which gave him immediate political power. His name, of course, was Adolf Hitler. The current that James called the Niagara Current was rushing even after the end of the war. But note, a countercurrent showed up in the same period. Mahatma Gandhi called for a fast and a strike against the British oppression in India, represented by something called the Rowlatt Rules. Rowlatt regulations discriminating against Indians in India. And the Rowlatt demonstration led by Gandhi established his power as the leader of the anti-British resistance in India, a man defined by his radical rejection of violence. I love thinking of Emmanuel College being established in that year, and I would love to think that Emmanuel College, too, was part of the countercurrent against that Niagara current that had carried the world into war and still had its way with the world. And I believe, if you look across the history of Emmanuel, you can see that that's true. Emmanuel has been a center of the countercurrent. I myself first experienced that in the person of Sister Maria Augusta Neal, whom I know revere here, longtime sociology chair, a great prophet of the Catholic anti-war movement and civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s. So that brings me to the second moment of context for the text, 1979. Some of you may remember 1979 because that was the year that YMCA by the Village People topped out at #2 on the pop charts. It was also the year that a Japanese company called Sony introduced a little machine called the Walkman. Little did we know. In 1979, Sister Janet Eisner was named president of Emmanuel College, a defining moment for this place. In 1979, Vietnamese forces defeated the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, a climax of post-United States chaos in Southeast Asia. In 1979, the Shah of Iran, an American puppet, fled from Iran. the Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran and immediately declared that the United States was the great Satan. In 1979, a war broke out between North and South Yemen, a war that still flares. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher became the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the first woman, the Iron Lady. The IRA seemed to take her ascendancy personally, launching bombs that year in Brussels, in London, throughout Northern Ireland. In 1979, the IRA murdered Lord Mountbatten, the last Viscount of India, a great hero of World War II, the uncle of Queen Elizabeth. In 1979, showing the current is global, the United States watched the USSR invade Afghanistan. 63 American hostages were taken in Tehran. Back home, a place called 3 Mile Island, we had never heard of it, suddenly became the fixation of the whole country because a nuclear power plant there went into meltdown. And the whole East Coast, the Northeast particularly, was in danger of being radiated. In 1979, OPEC raised gas prices by 25%, generating an energy crisis that we have yet to come out of. And in 1979, in response to that, President Carter issued what came known as the Carter Doctrine, which was the establishment of the principle that the United States of America claims the right to go to war to protect its access to Persian Gulf oil. But the countercurrent was running in 1979 too. Idi Amin, a grotesque dictator, was overthrown in Uganda. Anastasio Somoza was overthrown in Nicaragua by the Sandinistas. The Sandinista comandantes, 5 of them, included 2 Catholic priests. A great anti-nuclear movement sprouted in 1979, first with a big concert at Madison Square Garden, headlined by Bruce Springsteen and James Taylor and a dozen other superstars. No to nuclear weapons. A few months later, 200,000 people gathered at Battery Park in New York. No to nuclear weapons. Jimmy Carter in 1979 did something that's almost unthinkable today, and it would never be able to be done today. He returned the Panama Canal to the nation of Panama. Jimmy Carter welcomed representatives of Egypt and Israel to Camp David, and they signed the so-called Camp David Peace Accords, the first great peace treaty in the Middle East. The United States and the Soviet Union agreed to the SALT II Treaty, arms control as an alternative to antagonism in the Cold War, the beginning of the movement from strategic arms limitation, SALT, to strategic arms reduction, START, a turning point in the Cold War. In 1979, Mother Teresa got the Nobel Peace Prize. And in 1979, a Polish pope went home to Krakow. And when the Polish government gave him permission to say Mass in the Cathedral of Krakow, where he had been the Archbishop, he said, "I'll say Mass in the field outside of town." And they said, all right. They thought that was okay because nobody was going to go to this Mass anyway. What John Paul II knew was that the cathedral wouldn't be big enough, and 1 million people attended that Mass in the field outside of Krakow, and they all had the same experience, which was for the first time in decades, they could look around and see that they were not alone. And the theme of the Pope's sermon to them that day was, "Be not afraid." And a young, unknown electrician out of work who had hitchhiked down from Gdansk bought a pen at a souvenir stand that had a picture of the Pope on it. And a few months later, he used that pen to sign what should have been his death warrant. His name was Lech Walesa, And what he signed was the Charter of Solidarity, which came directly out of the Polish Pope's visit home, an insistence on nonviolence, which was the beginning, 1979, sister, with you, the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, a nonviolent grassroots democracy movement that spread through the satellite nations of the East, even into the Soviet Union itself. And what enabled the powers that be in the Soviet Union to respond to it nonviolently, as they would, was the fact that it was nonviolent from the bottom up. And a whole generation of people who had been told they were naive to believe in the power of nonviolent resistance were proven right. The current that Henry James warned of, Niagara Current, gripped the United States in ways that are almost impossible to understand. We did not want to be part of World War I. In 1916, when World War I climaxed in its most ferocious, foulest violence, the Battle of the Somme, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916, 55,000 British soldiers, Irish, Scots, Englishmen, were cut down dead in one day, charging across no man's land. And because the British High Command assumed that by sending wave after wave of Tommies and Jocks and Micks against the German machine guns on the other side of no man's land, the battle continued from July until November, with casualties approaching 1 million on both sides. That was the single most destructive moment in the history of the British Empire. And it was really what started the modern age, the age of disillusionment, of hatred of the fathers. How could they have done that to the sons? What were they thinking? Didn't they understand a machine is a machine, and that machine gun was never going to falter? And the charging of offense was always going to be cut down. And Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election that year under the slogan, "He kept us out of war." The United States, not a party to that madness. And yet we were drawn into it. And by the end of the war, we were empowered by it. And there was something at work in the American soul that was new. And because of that front fighter who got out of a hospital in Munich the year that this institution was founded, America found itself drawn into that European violence again, for good reason. But something gripped the soul of our country. And I want to bring your attention to one particular week in 1943, in which 5 momentous things happened. The first of which, it's like the most important thing in 1919 was Emmanuel College, right? The most important thing in 1979 was Sister Janet. The most important thing in that one week in January of 1943 is that was the week I was born. But look what else happened that week. At Casablanca, President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill agreed, because the war against the Axis powers had turned finally. We had won in Midway. Rommel was routed in North Africa. The British were reading the German codes. There was no question anymore of if we would win the war. The only question was when. And it was then that Churchill and Roosevelt, Stalin wasn't there, agreed that the end of the war would be a matter of unconditional surrender, which would have unexpected and momentous consequences at the end of the war. No negotiating, complete destruction of the enemy. That was one thing that happened that week. The other thing that happened that week was Roosevelt and Churchill agreed that Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces would begin a new strategy of aerial bombardment of German cities from the air. Strategic bombing of cities and urban populations, something that the United States Army Air Forces had refused to do until then on moral grounds. We don't bomb civilian populations. But after January of 1943, we did. The first raid against a German population center was led at the end of the month of January by a young Air Force colonel named Curtis LeMay. The third thing that happened that week, unconditional surrender was joined to unconditional destruction, because that was the week that an unknown laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico, opened. And something combined in these events to set a momentum going in America that nobody could have predicted would happen. And the fourth thing that happened that week, the Pentagon was opened. This is more than a building. It was the bureaucratizing of American military policy. Now, moral agency would shift from individuals to an anonymous bureaucracy in which no individual is in charge. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the momentum that was established then that led to crucial events going across the rest of the century that nobody, no single moral agent would have chosen. So at the end of the war, when the Germans were defeated, crushed, Hitler was dead, Mussolini was hung, and Japan was all but defeated, ready to surrender, looking for a way to surrender, desperate for one piece of assurance that the emperor would be respected. They had seen Mussolini lynched, and they had seen Hitler driven to suicide in a hole. They wanted their emperor, who to them was a divine being, respected. Give us the assurance that the emperor will be respected. And at the end of July, we responded with yet another demand of unconditional surrender. If we want to try and execute your emperor, we can. They understood. That was the end of July. And that was why, even though we didn't need to do it to win the war, and I know this is controversial, and some of you may disagree with me, and we can discuss it, we blew through the threshold of the end of the war and went on to use the atomic bomb when we didn't have to. Why? Not because we were wicked or evil, but because there was already something moving in us and under the current, under the surface of our life as a people. And the bombing of Hiroshima and then Nagasaki prompted the surrender of Japan. Yes. Hello, guess what? When the Japanese surrendered after Nagasaki, it was not unconditional. Truman had an emergency meeting of his war cabinet to discuss the surrender of the Japanese, because they put a condition on their surrender: if you respect the emperor. And they accepted the surrender anyway. Of course, they had to, because the emperor was needed for us to end the war. If the emperor didn't order all those thousands, hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers on islands throughout the Pacific to put their weapons down, they would never have done it. The point is that even by 1945, a momentum was established, and it was going to continue, and something was going to be moving in this country that few people understood and almost nobody would have chosen. So take, for example, the explosive growth of America's nuclear arsenal. In 1945, at the end of the year, we had 2 bombs. In 1950, we had 200 atomic bombs. In 1960, when John Kennedy became president, guess how many atomic and hydrogen bombs we had? We, just us. 10,000. Do I hear 11? We had 19,000. Mostly hydrogen bombs, the genocidal weapon. We didn't need 19,000 bombs. Why did we have them? Nobody thought that was a good idea. Everybody understood who thought about it. It was insane. 19,000 Hiroshimas? And that's what John Kennedy came into office aware of. And when he was confronted with the crisis over Berlin and then Cuba, he said, no, this is madness. This has to stop. And it was Kennedy, especially with the American University speech, the great June of 1963 American University speech, when he pleaded with the Soviet people directly to think of the conflict in a new way. And he called out to the whole human family for survival. And he said before the United Nations, if we don't destroy the weapons of war, they're going to destroy us. If human beings don't put an end to war, war will put an end to human beings. The impulse that had led to the League of Nations was born again, and the United Nations came into being as the alternative to war, the countercurrent, the great countercurrent pushing back. But the momentum, the mad momentum that nobody was choosing, continued. Kennedy turned against the nuclear arms race, 19,000 nuclear weapons. 20 years later, when Jimmy Carter became president, we had somewhere between 40 and 50,000 nuclear weapons, just our side. Between the Soviet Union, the United States, in those years, we created more than 100,000 of these monsters. Why? Even the most hard-bitten war hawk general did not think this was a good idea. What was going on? The Niagara current below the surface, Operation Point Blank, the bombing of cities, unconditional surrender, unconditional destruction, all managed by an impersonal bureaucracy in which really nobody is in charge. And in 1979, this voice says, be not afraid. And that countercurrent broke through the surface. Solidarity, the People's Forum, the democracy movements on the other side of the Iron Curtain, the anti-nuclear movement, the Freeze movement, started by a young woman across the river at MIT, Randy Forsberg, who said, we have to stop this madness. That group of 200,000 in 1979 at Battery Park in New York became 1 million people in Central Park a year later. The Freeze movement saying no. Jimmy Carter leaves office having added to the nuclear arsenal instead of shrinking it. And into American power comes the most hawkish, belligerent president we've had in a century, Ronald Reagan, who frightened the Soviet Union and frightened the people of the world, except for Margaret Thatcher, who experienced him as a cousin. And between the two of them, they represented toughness gone to a far extreme. If you have to destroy the earth to save it, that's what you have to do. And that madness broke through the surface with Ronald Reagan in his first term. The momentum, finally, nuclear armed and radically dangerous. And what happened? This is where that countercurrent, represented, I think, beautifully by this place, had its effect. Because in 1981, 82, 83, the first years of the Reagan administration, the people of this country, of Europe, and of the Eastern Bloc were heard. And they said, no, we must put an end to war before war puts an end to us. And it almost is enough to make you believe in God, what happened then. We had 3 Mile Island in 1979. In 1985, the Russians had Chernobyl, the meltdown of the nuclear power plant, which entirely discredited the old guard of the Russian establishment. And it gave the new prime minister, president of the Communist Party, his opening, Mikhail Gorbachev. And he took it. And he said, enough. And he said it to Ronald Reagan when they met at Geneva and then Reykjavik. And to the absolute astonishment of his inner circle, Alexander Haig, Jean Kirkpatrick, the absolute astonishment of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan said, "I couldn't agree more, Mikhail." And Mikhail Gorbachev, sitting at a table in Geneva, says to Reagan, "You know, why don't we just get rid of all of them?" And Reagan says, "That's what I've always wanted to do." And Gorbachev says, "You and I can do it." And the leader of the Soviet Union and the newly re-elected President of the United States suddenly came out as nuclear abolitionists. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a miracle of history. And they agreed in principle to eliminate both arsenals, Soviet and American, by the year 2000. Is that enough to make you weep? And you know they were stuck over Reagan's fantasy of Star Wars, which was a wild-eyed, cockeyed, fantastic, unworkable idea that you could stop a bullet with a bullet. But nevertheless, they didn't just limit nuclear arms, they began to reduce them. So in 1987 and 88, the arms race was turned around, and we went from that 100,000 to 70 to 80, to 70 to 60 to 50. Between Ronald Reagan's last term and the single term of George H.W. Bush, the United States cut its nuclear arsenal in half. Hello? Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, Republican hawks, cut the American nuclear arsenal in half. I'm talking about momentum. The Cold War was over. The justification for nuclear deterrence was gone. And what happened? This is enough to make you weep. In 1989, the nonviolent collapse of the Berlin Wall. Many of you remember it. All of you have heard of it. You know of its significance. The powerful, symbolic end of the Cold War, nonviolently, against the prediction of every expert. On November 9th, which is the anniversary of Kristallnacht, 1938, which was the beginning. Kristallnacht, the open demonstration of Nazi purpose with the Jewish people. On November 9th, that day was almost redeemed. It's truly unredeemable, but it was almost redeemed with the nonviolent dismantling of the Berlin Wall by people dancing on it. And what was the American response at that moment? It was to not believe it. And in December, we went to war in something called Operation Just Cause against, does anybody remember? Panama. Why? Why did we send 30,000 troops into Panama? Well, to capture Manuel Noriega, of course, the leader, the drug-running, corrupt CIA agent, head of Panama. But what was the real reason? The real reason was we were still at the mercy of that momentum. It made no sense. And not long after that, when Saddam Hussein moves into Kuwait, and the world is united against it, and a serious sanction regime is prepared to be imposed on Hussein, a sanction regime promoted above all by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Colin Powell, who did not want to go to war. We went to war. Mikhail Gorbachev, in the last days of the Soviet Union, his last days in power, disgraced in his home country for what he had done, pleading with Ronald Reagan, with George H.W. Bush, not to go to war. Why did we go to war in Iraq? That easy victory, right? It was no easy victory. That war is still going on. It wasn't Iraq 1 and Iraq 2. It's one long war. That war empowered al-Qaeda. That war is what made Osama bin Laden define us as the enemy. Everything we've been dealing with since 9/11 began 10 years before, in 1991. Why? Because of that momentum. That's how hard it is. I said before, Reagan and Bush Sr. reduced the American nuclear arsenal by half. How much did the Democratic peacenik president, Bill Clinton, reduce the American nuclear arsenal by? 0. Why? Because he didn't care? Of course he cared. He's as anti-nuke as you are, or as I am. He couldn't do it. The Pentagon had drawn a line with him. He couldn't cross it. That's the story of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Don't Ask, Don't Tell is not about homosexuality. As always, homosexuals are being scapegoated. The real don't ask us about our nuclear weapons. And we won't tell you how many we have left. That's what it was. It was a deflecting of the issue. And it immobilized President Clinton. Not his fault. That's what he was up against. And all of this is the background for what happened in this country on 9/11. Why did we respond the way we did? A crime which should have been treated as a crime, responded to with forceful, internationally coordinated, strong, and yes, violent police action, law enforcement. No, we didn't respond that way. We went to war, and we're still at war. Why? Because George W. Bush is callow and foolish? He may be callow and foolish, but that's not why. This is bigger than him. It's this momentum. Exactly the age of this college. And this is the river, the current into which Barack Obama stepped when he became president. Barack Obama knows all of this. He's smarter than any of us. And he knows the dangers of nuclear weapons and of war in the age of high technology better than anybody. He's a serious man about this. And yet, he too is at its mercy. How could he not be? You remember how much trouble there was 2 years ago about the $700 billion bailout money? How much debate there was? There's no debate every year in this country when we appropriate exactly that amount of money, $700 billion, to the Defense Department. We spend more money, you know this, but remember it, we spend more money in America on war and war readiness than the whole rest of the world combined. Think of these numbers, $700 billion, that's us. Our big threat out there is China. What do they spend? At most, $98 billion. Most of it is about Taiwan. Has nothing to do with us. The United Kingdom spends $69 billion. The French spend $67 billion. The Russians spend $61 billion. These are this year's figures. Iran, our great enemy, $9 billion. Pakistan, $4 billion. The military-industrial complex, of which President Eisenhower warned when he went out of office, just as John Kennedy was arriving when there were 19,000 nuclear warheads over which Eisenhower himself had presided. He knew it was madness. That's what he was warning us of. The military-industrial complex is bigger than that. It's the military, industrial, academic, congressional, court, barbershop, restaurant, candy bar, nursery school, cartoons, entertainment, reality shows, Walkman, iPod, everything complex. America is built on our military expenditures. We are a people who have defined ourselves by the readiness to go to war. And what has it done to us? And we see it in the difficulty even a good anti-war president like Barack Obama has, even though he gets it. Which is why, thank God, he restarted our relationship with Russia. And why, thank God, he has put peace in the Middle East at the center of his presidential purpose. The epiphany of 1945, what those hard-bitten survivors of World War II saw, is still in front of us. If we don't put an end to the weapons of war will put an end to us. I'm speaking personally here. I am the son of a soldier, and I see everything through a soldier's son's eyes. My father told me once that nuclear weapons, he was certain, are going to destroy the human species. He believed it would happen before the end of the 20th century. He was wrong because he didn't see that miracle of Reagan and Gorbachev coming. But it's still true. And we Americans have a special burden of moral responsibility. The American conscience, why? We hold the initiative. That's what $700 billion buys us. We have the upper hand on this question around the whole globe. What is the meaning of all this for you, for Emmanuel College? I want to say something in conclusion with a particular eye on the Catholic roots of this place. I know that not everyone here is Catholic, and those who are Catholic may have complicated or diverse ways of being Catholic. But there is something about the Catholic tradition that cries out to be lifted up here. The other thing that has happened in our lifetimes is we have moved from a war-making church, Pope Urban II, through crusades. Hello, it wasn't an accident that George Bush used the word crusade to describe the war on terror. Pope Urban II said, God wills it. Sacred violence. God wills the killing of the enemy. And in that case, by the way, it's not incidental, Muslims. And if on the way to get the Muslims you find Jews, kill them too. God wills it. 1096. For most of 1,000 years, war-making was blessed by the Catholic Church. Protestants joined in with ferocious enthusiasm. We went from that to Pope Paul VI, who stood before the United Nations in 1965, quoted John Kennedy, and said, "No more war. War never again." And that was the beginning of a peace church, following up on Pope John the 23rd, a hero of this place, whose greatest last will and testament was an encyclical called Pacem in Terris. Google it. Google it. Pacem in Terris, peace on earth. Read it. A pope who's questioning whether nuclear weapons can ever, as he put it, be an instrument of justice. And a pope who says that the three great signs of the times in our time are the rejection of colonialism by common people everywhere, the dignity of the labor movement and the rights of workers, and the extraordinary new movement being led by women, claiming full rights in every sphere, as he said. The three great signs of the times. And now, peace. And in all the years I've been in Boston, since 1969, that ideal has been alive here. John Paul II opposed every one of America's wars. Pope Benedict XVI has opposed every one of America's wars. Why? Because they're knee-jerk liberals? I don't think so. Why? Because after the Second Vatican Council, Christians generally, and Catholics in particular, had no choice but to return to the fundamental principle and power of this tradition, which is the memory of a man named Jesus, who was defined by his rejection of violence. And rejecting violence He rejected an empire, and the empire killed him for it, which is what empires will do every time. And this is what defines our religion. Catholic education must have peace at the center of it. And this is why church reform matters. I'm a reform-minded Catholic, like many of you. Why? Because we prefer the possibility of a married priesthood, or women ordained, or the rights of gay people, or equality and democracy in the church. Yes, all of that, but not just that. Because what's at stake? The survival of the human species is what's at stake. That's what's new since 1919, when this college was established. That's what those people who started the League of Nations understood, and who started the United Nations understood, and who survived the horrible nuclear arms race through the 70s and 80s understood. Even Ronald Reagan understood it. The survival of the human species is what's at stake. And the world needs rational, self-critical religion as part of that, as a precondition to that survival. Critical of violence. Give peace a chance. It actually is our only chance. And the beauty of the story I'm telling you is that for all of the power and terror of that Niagara current, isn't that wonderful countercurrent there too? And yes, the struggle between these two forces is not decided yet. That belongs to us, especially to those of you who inherit from people of my generation who came so far but not nearly far enough. Inherit this dilemma, this challenge, this mandate to change the meaning of human life on the earth. I want to close by returning to World War I. I began by remembering Henry James and his image of the Niagara current. It's very interesting to me that the same year that he said that, an obscure little prayer surfaced in a small French journal, La Clochette. Nicole, is that the little bell? My French teacher. Are you the reason my French is so bad? A little French journal called La Clochette published a prayer in 1913. It wasn't much noticed. Pope Benedict XV, who incidentally opposed World War I and was mocked for it, insisted in that pivotal year of 1916, that abyss of a year, 1916, he put that prayer on the front page of L'Osservatore Romano. And that's when that prayer swept around the world, addressing this countercurrent. Now, a lot of us have spent most of our lives thinking this prayer dated to the 13th century because it's called the Prayer of St. Francis. And you all know it. And I'm going to conclude by asking you to say it with me. But before reading the words, my text, after all this context, I want to draw your attention to the image in the first line. It's sometimes translated, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. You'll understand why, given this current image, I prefer the translation, Lord, make me a channel of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. I'm not actually putting you on the spot to say it with me, but I have to just emphasize to you, this is 1916, folks. 1916, this prayer surfaces in human awareness. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. Well, you can always tell the end when they say amen.